Last time we talked about a man named Jacob. Remember him? From the book of Genesis, way at the beginning. He was a dude whom straight stole his twin brother Esau's birthright over a bowl of food. Stew, for that matter. And we learned a few things from this. One is that while Jacob was in this for his own selfish desires and ambitions, God, well, still worked in his life. Okay, God didn't walk away. God didn't see the selfish ambition, see the living for himself, and just kind of turned away from Jacob. He didn't do that. God was still with him and made promises to Jacob, right, that he would fulfill in his life, because, well, that's who God is, right? It may not seem fair or just, but that's just who God is. Despite the bargaining from Jacob that if you, God, would, feed me, clothe me, and, save me from my brother's murderous rage on my life kind of thing, only then will I worship you and give you 1/10, okay? Which is kind of where this whole idea of a tithe comes from, right? Where the word tithe literally means 10%, right, of anybody's first fruits, okay? So the scripture was one of the first mentions in the Bible about tithing and giving to the Lord. Ironically, it comes from Jacob while he was bargaining with the Lord. Ironic, I know. So maybe keep in mind that scripture in its entirety, right, especially in the story about Jacob, points back to God. It always will and it always will, okay? Because we all probably at some level can relate to Jacob, right? We can, right? A lot of maybe doubt, bargaining with God, God, where are you? Kind of mentality. But to know without a shadow of a doubt that God doesn't walk away, okay? That he's present despite our own sin and misgivings. How about that, right? That's just the nature of God, right? And another thing, last thing we probably learn about Jacob's story is that, and his brother Esau, is that, well, we should never make any rash decisions while we are hungry, or starving for that matter, okay? So keep that in mind too. Now, today's scripture takes place generations and generations and generations later, okay, to the time of a man named Jesus, right, in the Old Testament. So we're gonna look at the or in the New Testament. I'm sorry about that. So we're gonna take a look at one of the teachings of Jesus from the New Testament. He is teaching in the midst of a crowd of people, and then tells a parable about a rich fool. Okay, so stay tuned. So our scripture today comes from Luke 12, verses 13 to 21. Luke 12, verses 13 through 21. The gospel writer says this in 13. Someone in the crowd said to him being Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he, being Jesus, said to him, "Friend, who sent me to be a judge or arbiter over you?" And he said to them, "Take care. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Okay? If you need to read that over, I encourage you to pause and read that scripture over, because there's a kind of a lot kind of going on in there. Now, first thoughts. Fighting over inheritance, okay, is a common problem in basically all societies, today even, and cultures. I've seen it with my own eyes, trust me. It stretches people out, and it literally divides families, right? Whether or not you have personal experience with that, or I'm assuming you probably know someone who may have this issue too, or a family that's been going through this. Now, in this scripture in Luke, a man comes to Jesus asking him to intervene with his brother to give him his inheritance. Now, Jesus refuses to take the role, of kind of this arbiter. So I ask, well, what is wrong with this man's request? Right? Why did Jesus kind of just like, no, I'm not going to do that? Why does Jesus talk about greed? Is it wrong to ask for your inheritance? Right? Now, it was common in the time of Jesus, back in this time, thousands of years ago, for the Jewish people to ask rabbis or teachers for legal advice or legal ruling. So hence this, this Jewish man who's asking Jesus, whom was a rabbi at this time, for this legal kind of advice in a lot of ways. So the man thought of Jesus as a respected teacher who influenced people and could convince his brother to give him his inheritance. Okay? By calling Jesus a teacher, he acknowledges his authority basically to render a decision in his case. Okay, so he's basically in this act showing a lot of respect towards the man that is Jesus. Okay, so the man seems, we're not entirely sure, but an educated guess kind of points the man posing this request to Jesus to be kind of a younger brother. Okay, because according to Scripture and the law of Deuteronomy, the firstborn son, this is something we talked about last week too with Jacob, the firstborn son receives a double portion, okay, of his father's main estate. Okay, a double portion, meaning he gets more. The firstborn gets more and also authority over the family. So the eldest brother is also responsible for keeping the estate intact or dividing it among his brothers. Therefore, the younger brothers initiate when asking for their inheritance. Okay, so to achieve basically a settlement, the younger brother asked Jesus to kind of play the role of an arbiter, expert, a reconciler, something like basically be a lawyer, basically, in order to settle this dispute. Okay, and Jesus says, "No, I'm not going to do that." He refused. Now, why? Why? How come? Well, if you look back at the Scripture, Jesus refuses to act as an arbiter or divider of inheritance because he knows, well, the younger man's or this man's personal, this particular man's inner thoughts and intentions. Basically, Jesus prophetically read him like a book, right? Jesus exposes the younger man's desire to covet his brother, and he said to them, "Take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Okay, so this younger brother was acting a little bit more selfish than what he was leading on to be. Jesus indicates that the young man's claim on inheritance is not just. Otherwise, well, the laws of inheritance would have taken care of the request. All right, okay, because being a good Jewish person, he knew these laws of inheritance. Right? It didn't take Jesus to say this, but there was something else going on, and Jesus read it like a book, and to which the conclusion was that this particular man was kind of in it to basically take more than maybe than the older brother was willing at this point, or he was a little bit more selfish. And then Jesus, he goes into parable mode, okay? And a parable, it's a story to tell some sort of spiritual truth about life, okay? So Jesus goes into parable mode, continuing on verse 16, and it says this: "Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly." Okay, now again, parables are basically maybe fictional stories to prove a very real point. Okay, so the land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry.'" Right? But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich towards God." Okay? Again, if you want to take a little bit of time to read that parable again by yourself, I really encourage you to do that. It would seem this younger brother, or the man at the beginning, wants to obtain more wealth and a more advanced status within his community at the expense of his older brother. Okay? So Jesus tells the parable of, quote unquote, the rich fool to teach against greed, right? Greed. He emphasizes that secure life does not depend on possessions, but on entrusting one's life to God. Okay, the scenario that Jesus depicts is a vast, wealthy landowner who had an abundant harvest, and decided, to tear down his current storage facilities to make room for larger ones. Okay, to make room for larger ones. Now, if you look at the Scripture again, there's a lot of I's and me's. Okay, there's a lot of I's and me. So it was a very self-centered way to kind of look at his abundance, his abundant crop, versus thanking God for what was kind of going on there. Okay, so if you look at that, it's an interesting little detail. Okay, where he's he's being very egotistical about this whole thing, like, look what I have done, kind of thing. all things being fair, this rich man, well, one could say, yeah, and I would probably agree, he was a very, very shrewd businessman, right? He knew what he was doing. One could easily argue that the rich man is a wise and responsible person, right? He has a thriving farming business. His land has produced so abundantly that he does not have enough storage space in his barns, right? So he plans to pull down his barns and build bigger ones to store all his grain and goods, right? Then he will have ample savings to set aside for the future and will be all set to enjoy life later. So he can retire or whatever, right? But his shrewdness, well, Jesus' point is, comes from an evil place, right? Comes from a very evil place. His decisions to do what he did, well, it also had a lot of economic implications as well. Now, being taught this thousands of years ago, basically a lot of the population back in this time were farmers or were in the agricultural business, right? And a lot of the agricultural businesses kind of knew the lingo and terminology that Jesus was using, okay? By building colossal storage, right, taking down his old barns and building huge ones, right? This rich landowner decides basically to hoard his harvest and not contribute to the market with his surplus, okay? Supply and demand, right? His intentions affect the food supply and create basically a scarcity of grain where people now will come to him for grain, right? In a lot of ways. And it ultimately drives the price up, right? So basically he could kind of call the shots, basically, of what to charge for the grain, because people would look at him now as almost like, oh my gosh, like we need to go to this person, basically. He becomes the center of his own world. This farmer is only interested basically in his well-being, ignoring the needs of the poor peasants around him who will be affected by his decisions, okay? So Jesus describes this self-centered farmer who makes an unethical profit and harms the economy, okay? So by hoarding his grain, this rich fool kind of basically secures his economic power and position of status in the village as others are made more and more dependent on him, okay? See what kind of what Jesus is getting at here is that, this guy is basically building his own empire for himself, okay, himself. The rich fool wants to control, the market at the expense of everyone, okay? So versus, rather just spreading it around, and being, generous with his surplus, he basically hoarded it all and became the center of his own, basically, empire and world, right? Basically where people come to him now for help. And he gets to control that, right? So that's kind of what's going on in this parable. So according to Jesus, this wealthy farmer is a fool because, well, he assumes that his security depends on his possessions and wealth, okay? Not God, okay? Not God, the source of all gifts and security. God summons his soul when the rich farmer invites his soul to be merry and enjoy wealth. In a single moment, all his hopes vanished, okay? That's what the end of the scripture is saying. God asks him a rhetorical question, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? Okay? Whose will they be? God's question means that he cannot take all this grain with him when he dies, right? Where's it going to go? Kind of thing, right? Nor does he know whose will they be, right? His children or his poor peasants, basically, whom he withheld his grain, may take them, but that's, he didn't plan for that, right? So it's like, where's this all going to go, when you die, basically? Jesus tells the audience, so it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich towards God. I'm going to read that one more time. So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich towards God. Interesting. Jesus means that the rich fool basically lost his soul, or sold his soul, to gain earthly possessions that will not benefit him in basically heaven or the afterlife, basically, right? The wise person is the one who is rich towards God, which means generous towards others in need. So this rich landowner is kind of the antithesis of that. Jesus further instructs his disciples about greed, trusting God to provide for their needs and not to worry about life. And that's the scripture after this parable, is that Jesus teaches about worrying, right? Do not worry, I will take care of you. Okay? Now again, greed, this idea of greed is a moral antithesis of generosity. It makes us worry about the future instead of trusting God, who literally holds the future. Okay? Greed destroys us, but on the other side of the coin, generosity blesses us. Okay, I want us to think about that. Greed destroys us, but generosity blesses us, doesn't it? The scripture invites us to reflect on what we do with our possessions. Do our possessions give us security for the future? Right? All our possessions are God's gifts to us. And as stewards, right, as hopefully good stewards of it, God calls us to share the gifts with those in need. Okay? This scripture we could go back to an Old Testament example of this in the book of Proverbs, right? And Proverbs is of the wisdom genre, and Proverbs 11:24 says this: "Some give freely, yet grow all the richer. Some give freely, yet grow all the richer. Others withhold what is due and only suffer want." Isn't that interesting? A generous person will be enriched, and one who gives water will get water. Okay? If you look at the world that we live in, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out there's greed all over the place, right? And people are trying to make a little bit of money on the side at the expense of others. We just went through the COVID pandemic. Toilet paper, anyone? That's what I'm talking about, okay? Now, to be crystal clear, the rich farmer in question is a fool, not because he is wealthy, okay? I want to make that really clear, okay? This rich fool is a fool not because he is wealthy or because he saves for the future, okay? Those are not reasons why he's a fool, right? That's not true. The rich fool is a fool because he appears to live only for himself, okay? And because he believes that he can secure his life with his possessions, okay? That makes him a fool, okay? Not because he is wealthy or saves for the future. Those aren't bad things. We can all agree on, right? Those are not bad things. But because he lives for himself and he believes that he can secure his life with the abundance of his possessions, well, that makes him a fool, right? And that's where Jesus kind of calls on and says, well, what are you going to do with that? Right? You have no one to pass it down to. You have no one to share it with. Where does it go when you die? It's just going to be wasted, basically, right? So when the rich man talks in this parable, again, he only talks to himself, right? And the only person he refers to is himself. What should I do, right? For I have no place to store my crops. I will do this. I will pull down my barns and I will build bigger ones, right? And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Now eat, drink, and be merry, right? It's a little me focused in a lot of ways. So the rich man's land has produced abundantly, yet he expresses no sense of gratitude to God or to the workers who have helped him plant and harvest this crop, right? He has more grain and goods in storage than he could ever hope to use, okay? It's just, that's the idea that Jesus wants to get us across. He has so much that in his lifetime he will never use, okay? Yet seems to have no thought of sharing it with others and no thought of what God might require of him. Okay, he's blind to the fact that his life is not his own to secure, that his life belongs to God and that God can demand it back at any time. Okay, so this rich man in this parable learns the hard way, right? He kind of learns the hard way. And this kind of reminds me of a scripture of a book in the Bible in the Old Testament called Ecclesiastes, right? Ecclesiastes wisdom, where it's realized quite simply that you can't take anything with you when you die, right? You cannot take anything with you when you die because, well, it's all meaningless, right? It's all vapor, right? It's all havel, H-E-V-E-L. That's the Hebrew word for vanity in a lot of ways. And if you think of a spray bottle spraying in the air, it kind of misses, you see it, and then it vanishes, right? So the teacher in Ecclesiastes is talking about that's kind of like our life. We're here one moment, and then bam, we're gone. So it's like, well, what do we do with our time here on earth? Kind of thing, right? Vanity, emptiness, right? Our reality is that no matter how much we have, we are always aware of things we don't have. That's just the nature of being a human in a lot of ways, right? And so we never quite feel that we have enough, right? To which the author of Ecclesiastes would say, it's all meaningless. It's all meaningless, right? It's all vanity because you work so hard to get it, and then you get it, then, well, just like that spray ball, you're here, and then poof, you're gone. And that's it, right? I want to share a quote from Elizabeth Johnson, whom is a PhD in biblical studies from Princeton Theological Seminary. Really smart woman. And she says this: like the rich farmer, we are tempted to think that having large amounts of money and possessions stored up will make us secure. Sooner or later, however, we learn that no amount of wealth or property can secure our lives. No amount of wealth can protect us from a genetically inherited disease, for instance, or from a tragic accident. No amount of wealth can keep our relationships healthy and our families from falling apart. In fact, wealth and property can easily drive a wedge between family members, as in the case of the brothers fighting over their inheritance at the beginning of this text. Most importantly, no amount of wealth can secure our lives with God. Right? It's not that God doesn't want us to save for retirement or future needs. Okay? It's not that God doesn't want us to eat, drink, and be merry, because He wants us to be, live in abundance, right? And enjoy what God has given us. We know from the Gospels that Jesus spent time eating and drinking with people all the time, right? And enjoying life, right? Even people He was supposed to eat and drink with. He enjoyed His life. But He was also clear about where His true security laid, right? And that's something we could all ask ourselves right now too, is that, where does our true security lay? Right? And that's an honest question that we could all ask ourselves right now. Comes down to priorities, doesn't it? Comes down to priorities. It's about who is truly God in our lives. Right? And that's another thing that we could kind of pose to ourselves too. That's hard sometimes, right? And I get it. It's about how we invest our lives and the gifts God has given to us. Because if you think about all the things that we have, all the material possessions we have, the point Jesus is making in this parable is that it's all a gift. It's all a gift from Him. And if we treat it as a gift, hey, gifts, well, they're easier to share, aren't they? Right? It's about how our lives are fundamentally aligned towards ourselves and our passing desires, or on the other hand, towards God and our neighbor, right? Towards God's mission to bless and redeem the world, okay? As we conclude, Jesus kind of put it in a way where this rich fool could kind of really take it home to where, hey, what's going to happen when you die, right? Because death has a way of clarifying what really matters, right? It has a big way of clarifying what really matters in our lives, right? Unfortunately, right? So our lives and possessions, the point Jesus is trying to make as we conclude here, are not our own, okay? They just aren't. They belong to God, right? They belong to God. We are merely stewards of them for the time God has given us on this earth. Now, we rebel against the truth because we want to be in charge of our lives and our stuff, but at the end of the day, just like this rich fool, it's God who has the future in His hands, not us, right? But at the same time, He's calling us to make good decisions and also be good stewards of what He has given or the gifts that He has given to us. So may we be able to really have that perspective that the things that we have are gifts. They are gifts from a God who loves us, that cares for us, and wants to see us thrive and continue His mission, meaning that, unlike the rich fool, to be able to share from the abundance of what we have. And sometimes it may not be money or wealth or a lot of possessions, but maybe it's our time, right? Maybe it's our efforts. Maybe it's the things that God has calling us to do or convicting us in that aren't necessarily material, okay? And we could think about that and maybe process through that, because at the end of the day too, just like the writer of Ecclesiastes would say, death has a way of clarifying what matters. Because, right, we're here for one moment and then poof, we're gone for another. So Wherever this meets us, I pray that God would be able to reach us and meet us, and that we may experience his grace and peace.